All right. So rich countries are rich because a worker can produce more in an hour, right, than they can in a poor country. But when it comes to what determines high productivity, we talked about three things. And what are those three things?
Education was one of them, yeah.
Right. What we call human capital.
Physical capital.
Physical capital. And then the third?
Technology.
Technology. And of these, which one is the most important?
Technology.
Technology, right? Because the problem with physical capital, as we talked about, is this problem of diminishing marginal returns. That yes, you can grow by adding more and more capital, but the benefit that you get from adding more capital diminishes the more capital that you have. And so that's a big limit to growing simply by accumulating physical capital. And there's also big limits to growing only by increasing human capital, because human capital actually is very costly and it's time consuming, as you know, right? You basically have spent what will end up being the first 16 years of your cognizant life in school, right? So it's slow and it's time consuming. So technology is the most important way that we increase productivity and we increase standards of living. But then we wanted to dig deeper. We wanted to talk about, well, then why is it that rich countries have more human capital, more physical capital, and more technology, right? Why is that? And this is where we left off on Monday, talking about institutions. Meaning the incentives created by governments and society, so it's not just government, to engage in productive behavior. Not theft. In other words, the extent to which incentives in your society encourage making goods as opposed to taking goods. So, I talked about Genghis Khan, right? And Mark Zuckerberg, right? They're both entrepreneurs, but one of them lived in a society that very much incentivized taking as the way to get ahead. The other lived in a society that very much incentivized making as a way of getting ahead. And so that's going to have profound impacts on your incentives to accumulate technology and physical capital and human capital, right? And so the extent to which your society doesn't view everything as a zero sum, right? In other words, if I get ahead, I take from you, and if you get ahead, you take from me. That's the kind of behavior that is not conducive to growth. Growth is about making more, right? Enlarging the size of the pie so that when you break up the pieces, they're bigger for everybody. So to do that, you have to create incentives for people to engage in productive behavior. And so we started talking about, well, what exactly does this mean? We talked about the importance of property rights. Basically, if people can't keep the fruits of their labor, they're not going to labor, right? You have to figure out a way of allowing people to keep the fruits of their labor, to keep some of the benefits of their ideas. And so we had talked about the Industrial Revolution. What drove the Industrial Revolution? It was not new technology, because most of the technologies that existed at that time had existed for a long time. What changed was basically the way that society organized itself, with a re-emphasis on individual rights and a new emphasis on property rights, that the government couldn't just take everything that you have, that there were actually protections against other people taking everything you have, right? That ability to be able to keep what you make fundamentally changed incentives, right? In places like Britain and the US. Related to this, certainly one of the characteristics of countries with productive institutions is they have political stability, legal stability, and economic stability. Right? Meaning you, for instance, you have legal systems where you can do things like enforcing contracts. You have legal systems that limit crime. One of the big differences we've seen between richer countries and poor countries is the amount of corruption, particularly government corruption, right? Because one of the roles of government here is to make sure that more people are making than taking. To the extent that the government itself becomes a big taker, that is not going to create the incentives for people to produce, right? So these kind of things matter. Not having coups or wars, right? I mean, these things sound pretty obvious, but they're very, very important in creating the kind of stable environment in which people want to build things. There's so much that I could say here, and honestly, just to give you a little behind the scenes and thinking about what I wanted to talk about today, this is always a hard lecture for me because honestly, on each one of these things, I could spend hours talking about, right? And in fact, if any of you are really interested in these things, I would encourage you to take macroeconomic seminar, right? Or go to my China class, where really we spend a lot of time talking about institutions and what institutions are so important to growth, which ones are not as important to growth, how do institutions differ across countries. I mean, to me, this is a really interesting topic. And so, it's hard for me to say, well, low corruption is good without talking about the thousands of economic studies and the really interesting research that has been done looking at corruption and exactly how corruption can kill growth. But just to give you one example of how legal systems and corruption can kill growth, let's talk about the example, and this is actually an example that also relates back to property rights, the example of land title. Land title and land ownership. Okay, this seems like a kind of a boring topic, right? Who cares about land title? This is one of the fundamental things that makes rich countries rich, is actually having a register in which people can formally own the land that they live on, okay? This is something in the United States that we take for granted. But in other parts of the world, we cannot take this for granted. That many people live on land that they might have lived on for generations, but they do not formally own it because they don't have the legal title. This is one of the big differences between North America and South America, right? Those of you who have taken any history courses of South America, you'll know that one of the big differences between North America and South America is the actual way that they were settled. North America, we all know, was basically kind of homesteaders, right? Homesteaders were, when North America was colonized, it was basically settled by homesteaders, meaning Europeans in this part of the world, particularly people from Britain, UK, and England, at least in the initial phases, moving to the United States and setting up farms to live. Because they were going to live there, they actually took the time to set up a system in which you could legally own property and you could register that property. This is much different than how South America was generally settled. South America was not settled by homesteaders. It was largely settled under the hacienda system. The hacienda system basically involved a small number of landholders owning huge tracts of land. Who would work this land? Well, temporary migrants from Europe or indigenous people or natives. So this hacienda system involved very few people owning huge tracts of land. Now, when South America basically went through the colonization phase and many of the countries in South America became independent, many of these haciendas broke up. But the problem was that many people continue to live on these haciendas, but were never given official title to the land. And so even today, you have millions of people living in South America who have lived on land, but they don't own it. And when you don't own it, it fundamentally changes your incentives, right? Because you don't have the same incentive to invest in the land. You don't have the same incentive to make changes to the land. And very importantly, you can't use the land as collateral to get a loan. And without a loan, it's difficult to make improvements in the land. So this whole idea of a legal system, these are the parts of a legal system that most of us don't think about on a day-to-day basis, but they're really important. Who owns what? And do we all agree upon who owns what? Because ownership is a big part of creating incentives to engage in productive behavior. Why haven't South America been able to create a land ownership system, a land title system? Well, that's the question of many economists. And I want to show you a picture here. This picture was created by Hernando de Soto, who's an economist from Peru. And he's actually done a lot of his research on this question about land title and ownership. And so he got together a team of kind of graduate students. And so he went through many countries and figured out what was the process you have to go through to become the legal owner of land that you're on. So let me show you an example of one of the flow charts that he put together. Okay, hopefully you can see this. This is the procedure to form a legally obtained home in Peru. The procedure consists of 5 stages. The first stage alone consists of 207 steps. De Soto estimated that it would take between 17 and 21 years to complete all of these steps in Peru to legally obtain your home. What in the hell is going on here? Why in the world would the government of Peru make it so difficult to legally obtain your home? To get a legal title to your home? What's going on here? Do they not want to grow? Logan says, corruption, question mark? Yeah, corruption, period. This is corruption, right? If you're a bureaucrat, how do you leverage your power? You create more steps, more paperwork, more people that you have to see, more bribes that you have to take. I mean, this is the consequence of corruption, right? When you have a weak government, many of these bureaucrats don't get paid except through the corruption that they're able to, and the bribes that they're able to collect. And so what you have is these systems that get built over time in which, you know, corruption is endemic. Corruption both in terms of the amount of bribes that you have to pay, but corruption in terms of the steps and the paperwork and the time that you have to pay for, right? Sunny says in some parts of Pakistan, the same thing is happening. Yeah, and in some parts of many of the world, the same thing happens, right? There's a website I kind of encourage you to go look at sometime. It's called I Paid a Bribe. I think it's called iPaidAbribe.com. But it's a website created by people in Nigeria who basically post the bribes that they have to pay on a daily basis, right? Because in Nigeria is kind of infamous for corruption, that police will stop you for anything. And basically they'll stop you, and then how do you get away? Well, you pay them a bribe, right? And so this just happens all the time. And so this is what happens when you have countries that have weak governments with lots of corruption, is not only do people pay in terms of, the bribes and the wasted time, but they pay in terms of lower growth, because this doesn't incentivize people to make things, it incentivizes them to pay things. So I'm reading here, Sunny, and it says in the chat, some parts of Pakistan, the same thing is happening. If you pay off the Patwari, the man in charge of the land documentation, you could most likely make changes to the document. That will make it really difficult for the actual owner to acquire ownership rights, and someone else will continue living on it. Yeah, right. I mean, this is a common problem. I've been talking about South America, but this is a common problem in many parts of the world, where land ownership and other forms of ownership just are not clear. And so without those property rights, with high corruption, it creates just a lot of instability, a lot of theft, right? It creates a lot of theft. Let me talk about a couple of other things that create good institutions or bad institutions. Stable macroeconomic policy. In other words, listening to your econ professors, which is something you should all do, is generally creates growth, right? But some countries have not listened to their econ professors. Particularly, we've talked in this class about some of the policies that countries should follow if they want to promote growth, such as last week we talked a lot about stable inflation, right? Stable inflation is a way to promote growth by promoting healthy financial systems. Next week, we'll have a lot more to talk about predictable fiscal policy. Reasonable taxation and government spending. We'll have a lot more to say about all of these next week. But your macroeconomic policy can also create the kind of incentives for people to take as opposed to make, right? I think one of the things we talked about last week was how governments that create lots of inflation give people incentive to put all their money in things like gold as opposed to putting it in the financial system. But gold does not lead to productive investment. And so that's one way that bad policy creates poor incentives, right? And creates bad institutions. Another very important goal for governments is promoting competitive markets. It seems to me one of the real interesting questions that's going on in American society right now, and related to our economy, is to what extent are these big IT companies like Amazon, Google, Apple, Facebook monopolies? Because quite honestly, looking at the numbers, it's hard to argue that they are not a monopoly, right? If you look at, for instance, Google, right? Google now controls something more than 80% of all online advertising. I mean, that is a massive number. That's the kind of number that makes you think that, yes, they are essentially a monopoly. What are we going to do about that? That's a really interesting question. Now, this is a hard question because to some extent, there are advantages to monopolies, right? It's nice to have one search engine that kind of covers the entire internet. And it's nice to have one company that can provide you all of these services that are linked. But I think we also know there's big danger to giving one company so much market power. And so, this is one of the things that I think economists are debating amongst themselves, but we as a society have to think about, is to what extent should we be breaking these things up? We need government regulation, but not too much. Right? We want government regulation, but we don't want what's happening in Peru, right? Government regulation is important because not all markets are perfectly competitive. But there's also a danger of too much government regulation. And, once again, it feels there's so much more that I could say about this exactly, but just in the interest of time, I'm not going to say much more about this other than, right, take some more econ classes, right? And we can talk, there's a lot more to be said about the role of government regulation in the economy, but, in the broadest terms, some regulation is needed, but you can have too much regulation because you can get a situation like Peru, right? Where the regulation itself becomes a way for some people to take from other people, right? One of the things that we observe about countries that have productive institutions is they promote international trade. Why is trade so beneficial? Well, last week we talked about this. Who can help me out? What's the main reason why international trade is so beneficial? Rakeem, what did we talk about last week regarding international trade and why it's so beneficial?
It allows other countries to get products that they don't specialize in.
Right, specialization, right? That's the magic word. Comparative advantage. Comparative advantage and specialization, right? That is a key part of why trade is so good for countries. But I also want to be clear that trade allows for other benefits. One of the most important reasons why trade is good, it allows for technology transfer. In other words, when you trade goods and services, you're not just trading those goods and services, you're also trading ideas. This is now I'm starting to sound like a broken record, but here's another example of a topic that we could go on for hours about, the economics of technology. But if I could just say one thing about technology, technology does not come from one genius sitting in a room. Technology universally comes from networks of people, right? Technology and ideas is almost always networked, meaning it comes from multiple people sharing ideas back and forth. And so what happens when you allow for technology is you actually allow for bigger networks. And these bigger networks help you share ideas. Finally, trade allows for foreign investment. It's a way to increase physical capital by being able to borrow from abroad. It is a fact that countries that trade more are richer. Why? Because they're able to leverage specialization, technology transfer, and foreign investment. So if I can just show you a little visual about this, I hope you can read this. It's a little small. But look at the figure on the left side of the page here. This is, it says that countries that trade more have faster growth in GDP. So this is looking at the growth in GDP, and broke countries into three categories. Rich countries, which is the black, non-globalizers, which means those are the countries that are not open to trade, poor but not open to trade, and globalizers. That means countries that are poor but open to trade. And what have we seen here, particularly if we look here in the 2000s and 2010? The countries that have grown the fast are the poor globalizers, right? They're the countries that are poor, but they're open to trade. Why? Because they gain a lot from specialization, technology transfer, and foreign investment, right? And so countries that trade more grow faster. If you look at the figure on the right-hand side, this is looking at unemployment rates. And we see the flip side of this, which is that countries that grow faster also have lower unemployment rates. So once again, the globalizers have lower unemployment rates than the non-globalizers. Okay? So trade is one of the strongest relationships we see in the economic growth literature, right? Is one of the strongest traits that we see in the economic growth literature. Sunny asks in the chat, a few years ago when the new government came into power in Pakistan, they said that Pakistan's foreign direct investment limit is $2 billion, and I never understood it. Is there a limit to how much a country can absorb in terms of foreign direct investment? Well, not really. I don't know why you would do that, because that seems like a uniquely stupid idea. So foreign direct investment is a special kind of investment, foreign investment. It's when a foreign company actually sets up a factory in your country. Okay, so foreign direct investment in Pakistan would be, for instance, Google setting up a business in Pakistan. Okay, foreign direct investment is very, very valuable. Why? Because it's not just the physical capital, it's a great way to get that technology transfer, right? So when Google sets up a business in your country, they're also going to bring with them a lot of know-how, a lot of human capital with them. So foreign direct investment in many ways is the most attractive or the most beneficial form of investment. Why would Pakistan be limiting that? I have no idea, other than it goes back to this idea of discrimination against foreigners and hate of the other, right? I mean, it's kind of nationalist idea that, well, we have to make everything ourselves, right? It's a bad one. So to build on this, let me just tell you the little story about Asia and Africa. If we went back to the 1900s, which area of the world was richer, Asia or Africa? Africa. Africa was richer than Asia 120 years ago. Today, Asia is about 2.5 times richer on a per capita basis than Africa. What in the world happened? What happened was trade, right? Basically, the short story is that most countries in Africa and countries in Asia became independent in the 1960s. They ended their colonial rule, colonial systems, and became independent. However, the process that they followed was much different. In Africa, they tended to follow closed door policies. And part of this is the reflection of the history of Africa trade, right? So Africa was, obviously a huge source for a vast majority of the world's slave trade. And so many African countries, when they became independent, said, we want to close our doors. We don't want to trade with anybody anymore. We want to become self-dependent. We're going to make our own stuff. Well, you can understand that idea, but the fact of the matter is you have 53 countries in Africa, all of them pretty small. What's the chance that every country in Africa is going to be able to make a productive, IT company or a productive car company, or be able to make their own beer, or whatever it is you're talking about? It just was simply not realistic. And so most of these countries in Africa were not able to create, competitive, productive industry because they weren't able to get the specialization they needed, the technology they needed from other countries. Asia, on the other hand, in general, has followed the opposite tact. They have focused on exports and trade as a key to their development. What that's allowed them to do is to specialize, to engage in technology transfer, to get a lot of foreign investment. That is a big part of the reason why Asia has grown a lot faster than Africa. And so, it's the approach to trade, right? Trade is a hugely, hugely important part of development. And so, we see that, right? We see that when we kind of do this case study of Africa versus Asia, is in hindsight, the choices that African countries made when they became independent in the 60s was a bad one, right? A very bad one. Very quickly here, let's talk about a couple of other things. And by the way, this is not an inclusive list. This is not everything that impacts institutions. But countries, obviously, that have good institutions will promote quality education. Notice here, I emphasize the word quality and not quantity. Today, 99% of the world's children are eligible to enroll in a free education. Okay? So the question here is not, can you get an education? The question is the quality of education, right? And it's in the quality of education that we see huge, huge disparity between countries, right? On any given day in India, 30 to 40% of teachers don't show up for their jobs. Okay? That's just a fact, right? On any day in India, 20 to 25% of doctors will not show up for their jobs, right? So, you have this consistent problem with quality of education, right? Many teachers in many countries don't have much more than an elementary education themselves. So, once again, there's a lot to be said here about this, but the quality in education across the world varies greatly. And that is one thing that obviously holds a lot of countries back, is that they simply don't have the quality of education they need to help them produce the goods that allow them to become competitive in global environments. There is a role for governments and societies to promote R&D, specifically basic science. Right? By creating the situations in which basic research and development is encouraged. What do I mean by basic research and development? Basic research and development is really the research and development that doesn't have a direct profit implication, right? In other words, it's research and development that, at least as far as we can tell, will not lead to profits, right? So, for instance, think about Albert Einstein, right? And his theory of relativity. That's basic science, right? Thinking about how the universe works, that's basic science. Of course, without the theory of relativity, we would not have GPS, right? We would not have all the other things that come from GPS, global positioning systems, right? So nobody would have, if it wasn't for, governments in Austria and the United States promoting Einstein, right? And promoting his basic science, we would have never had these other scientific endeavors that actually did end up creating huge profits, right? And so promoting the kind of basic science without a direct, at least as far as we can tell now, without a direct profit motive, that's a really important thing. Also, patent protection. So once again, there's so much to say about patents that I really have to be careful here that I don't go off on a rant about patents. But I'll just say very briefly, patent protection is a way that governments can promote research and development. Why? By essentially allowing companies that create new ideas to become monopolists for a period of time. And that's what a patent is, right? You're basically saying you're the only producer of that good, you can become a monopolist and you can get monopoly profits. Of course, you can go overboard on patents, right? We don't want every idea to be patented, because if every idea gets patented, then what that means is that people can't use ideas, and it's gonna prevent the sharing of ideas. The example I always give about, this balance is the idiocy of the Amazon one-click button, right? So you guys saw that I am shopping on Amazon. I am an Amazon shopper, as much as I sometimes hate it. Those of you who shop on your phone on Amazon, you might notice like the one-click button, right? That you just hit one button and it purchases it. Do you know that Amazon patented that? Notice that you can't do the one-click thing on other websites. Amazon somehow actually got a patent for that, which is crazy. It's actually crazy. To get a patent for a good, it is supposedly supposed to be novel and non-obvious, right? To get a patent for a good, it needs to first be novel and non-obvious. The one-click button neither seems to me to be novel or non-obvious, yet somehow Amazon was able to get a patent for that. And that's why other companies can't use it. That's an example of where we haven't drawn the correct lines in terms of patent protection, right? And so there's a huge literature in economics about what kind of ideas should we patent, but what kind of ideas should we not patent? And there is a good argument to be made that our patent system doesn't necessarily always do a good job of distinguishing between the two. Faith asks, how long does a patent last? It's different for different kinds of goods. Typically, it's between 17 and 21 years. So it's a long time. It's a long time, 17 to 21 years. So yeah, there are tremendous monopoly profits to be made. And of course, the idea for a patent is, companies won't make all the research and development investments they need unless they have some idea that there's going to be a big payoff at the end. So, the economics behind patent, yes, there is a role for patents, but you also don't want to patent everything, right? And I think that's kind of the trade-off that needs to exist in the patent system. And as I said, without getting too much into the details, there's good reason to think that our patent system always doesn't draw the line well. So these are some of the things, not all the things that impact institutions, but some of the things that impact institutions. You notice here, I haven't talked about a number of things. But there is a number of things that don't have to matter when it comes to institutions. There's a number of things that you might have, before you took this class, you might have thought matter, but in fact, economists really have some severe questions about these. One of them is natural resources. Does having natural resources make you rich? No. No, and once again, think about this distinction between Africa versus Asia. Africa is much more heavily laden with natural resources, and yet it is the part of the world that's not growing. There is a lot of evidence that there is a resource curse. In other words, having resources can be as much of a curse as it is a blessing. And why is that? Because it creates bad institutions. You all have heard about blood diamonds, right? That's a classic example of how having a natural resource can actually destabilize your institutions, right? So you have a country here that has diamonds and they're pretty easily accessible. And so what do people do in that country? Instead of focusing on making things, they focus on fighting each other so that they can get the diamonds, right? It leads to conflict, it leads to war, it tends to centralize power in the hands of people who are ready to take and better at taking. We've talked a number of times about the Congo, right? The Congo is the poorest country in the world. The Congo is also one of the most resource-rich countries in the world. And if you know anything about the history of the Congo, which I would encourage all of you at some point, and I'm happy to give you some book recommendations to read about the history of the Congo. One of the reasons the Congo is so poor is because it has so many natural resources. And as a result, basically over the years, the Congo becomes just a source of exploitation. You exploit the people to get rubber, you exploit people to get ivory, you exploit people to get rare earth minerals, you exploit people to get diamonds, right? It becomes all about taking and nothing about making. So there is a good argument to be said that resources, we see countries that don't have a lot of natural resources become rich. And then we see countries that have lots of natural resources become poor. Once again, it really gets back to the institutions, right? If you have good institutions, natural resources aren't a prerequisite to growth. The same to be said for foreign aid. There was this belief that if you give a country money, they'll get rich. But in fact, what we observed is that money given to countries with poor institutions only fosters more corruption. A lot of foreign aid over the years has been wasted by simply giving money to countries, but without the proper institutions in place first, all the money does is just foster more corruption. I don't want to say that foreign aid is a bad idea. I definitely do not. There are some forms of foreign aid that work very well, particularly in public health, for instance. Public health is one areas where foreign aid, I think, has been very, very useful in improving the lives of people in poor countries. But a lot of foreign aid has gone to things like building roads and bridges and dams. And, over the years, a lot of that money has just been wasted, right? It's just been wasted. And all it's done is foster corruption. Remember, on Monday, we talked about our good friend Thomas Malthus and his idea that having more population will make you poor. How has his prediction about the future turned out? Not so good. Right? that relative to when Malthus lived, the world population has gone up by a factor of 7. And what's happened to global per capita income? It's going up by a factor of 20. We have gotten richer as our population has gotten bigger, right? So as Sonny says, Malthus was miserably wrong, right? Or dismally wrong, right? Just like it's the dismal science. He was wrong. Why is that? Because in many ways, population is not the key thing. If you can innovate, it's technology that allows us to produce more. That's the most important thing. And interestingly, one of the things we observe is that you have more people, you have more technology. You have more people that can invest in making ideas. Interestingly, where are the richest areas of the globe? Cities, where people live in the closest contact with each other. And so we see this time and time again. What are the richest countries? Bigger countries tend to be richer than smaller countries. Cities tend to be richer than non-cities. More people tends to make you rich, right? And so Malthus had it exactly wrong. There's another reason why Malthus was wrong. That's even at a deeper level. What happens is we've gotten richer. As we've gotten richer, one of the things we've observed is that we're having less kids, fewer children. You might have seen this in the news yesterday, but the preliminary results from the US Census came out. And the decade between 2010 and 2020 in the US was the lowest rate of population growth in the US in over 90 years, right? Our population grew very, very slowly. There's a lot of reasons for that. There's a lot of things going on with that. But if we look across the world, what do we see? Richer countries have fewer kids. In general, as people get richer, they have fewer kids. Global population growth is slowing because globally, the population is getting richer. Why is that? Who wants to help me out here? Why is it that richer families have fewer kids? What do you think that is?
I know in the case of like my grandma, she had 7 siblings because they needed people to work the farm because there wasn't tractors and things like that when she was born in the 1920s. So
Exactly. Right. It used to be the case that when you had kids, they were labor. Nowadays, when you have kids, what do? Do you make them work the fields? No, you send them to cello lessons and soccer lessons. And in fact, instead of making things, they take your money. These are the things your parents are thinking about you while you're gone from the house, right? Yeah, I mean, the whole nature of how we raise children has changed in part because of the change in the nature of our economy. We are no longer a labor-intensive economy. We have moved from a labor-intensive economy to an ideas-intensive. And part of that is we've moved from thinking about the quantity of children to this is a rough way of saying it, kind of crude, the quality of children. I'm going to have fewer children and invest more in each of them. So Faith and Sunny in the chat say, has the cost of raising children gone up? Yes, but that's mainly because of the ways that we choose to raise children, right? It's because of the ways that we choose to raise children. Yeah, in the old days, your parents probably did not pay for cello lessons and swim lessons and soccer lessons and, private tutoring for your SAT or any of the other things that some parents spend money on, right? But now that's kind of thought of as a baseline. Why? Because we have to prepare our kids for an ideas-intensive economy, right? We're not preparing them to be farmers. We're preparing them to work in a globalized economy. And so what does this mean? You have fewer children and invest more in them, in each one of them. And honestly, this is not just happening in the richest of the rich countries like the US. This is happening across the globe. In places like India, certainly it's happening in China, but even places like Vietnam, right? As they get richer, what's happening to their birth rates? They're going down significantly. Because as they get richer, they can afford to have fewer children and invest more in each one of them. And as they get richer, the nature of their colleges, the nature of their economies are changing. So Zach asks, are colleges scared about enrollment because of this? Yes. Yes. This is a big worry for many colleges, is the demographic problem, right? It actually, in fact, in the literature, it's the demographic cliff, right? That the fact that the birth rates in the US has gone down so much is putting a big squeeze on colleges who can expect to have fewer students in the future. How do we correct that? Well, one of the ways is we need more people to go to college, right? A higher percentage of the population to go to college. And I think that's something that not just would be good for more people, that would be good for the economy as a whole. I think the other thing that we need to do is have more immigrants and more foreign students, right? Because, there's huge benefits, as I've tried to talk about again and again, of immigration, not just for the people who are immigrating, but for the country that they immigrate to. So, in the US, in fact, the reason why we don't have more of a demographic problem is because we have immigration. Even though immigration is definitely at a 30-year low right now. But we would have even more problems if it wasn't for immigration. Okay, I want to talk about one last thing here, and then we're going to take a break. Culture. I have decidedly tried to avoid talking about culture as a reason why some countries are rich and other countries are poor. However, many people talk about culture as if it's culture that causes you to be rich or poor. Probably the most famous of these is a German philosopher by the name of Max Weber. And Max Weber, actually, if you take some philosophy classes, you'll probably run across him in a number of circumstances. But Weber actually was interested in this question of, why is Northern Europe richer than Southern Europe? Why is Northern Europe richer than Southern Europe? And so he had this idea of what he called the Protestant work ethic. Right? That Northern Europe is Protestant and Southern Europe is Catholic. And Weber said, well, it's a cultural thing. Protestants are trained to work harder than Catholics. And so what was Weber's thinking? Well, Weber's thinking really had to do with religious differences. And without getting into a lot of these, Weber pointed to a number of things. For instance, one of the things that we see let me back up here. Weber was writing in the early 1800s, right? So he was writing a couple of hundred years ago. But one of the things we see is that Protestant countries tended to have higher literacy rates than Catholic countries, in part because Protestants have a personal relationship with God and are expected to read the Bible, as opposed to Catholics who traditionally have a less personal relationship with God, in that they really have the clergy intercede with them, right? So if you've ever been to a Catholic service and a Protestant service, you might have noticed this difference, right? That at Protestant service, there's a lot more reading from the Bible, right? And a Catholic service, probably not as much, right? That's a fundamental difference that Weber pointed out. Weber also focused on this idea of, for those of you who are into religious studies, the idea of predestination. Protestants traditionally have believed that who's going to heaven is predetermined before you're even born. How do you show that you're one of the people that goes to heaven? You become successful in this life. Successful meaning monetarily successful. And so Weber argued that this religious belief caused people to work harder and save more, as opposed to Catholicism, which does not have the same indoctrinated belief in as to the relationship between success in your earthly life and success in your afterlife, right? So this is an idea that has a long history in economics, that somehow people's religious beliefs or other cultural beliefs can cause them to be rich. Well, you know what? That some of this actually kind of sounds good until you think about it a little bit more. You know, listen, the problem is it possible that culture could have some impact on economic outcomes? Sure. I mean, for instance, think about the attitude in some Muslim countries towards women. Right? In extremely conservative, fundamentalist Muslim countries, women are not allowed to work outside of the house. They're not allowed to leave the house without head coverings. That undoubtedly plays a fundamental role in economic outcomes.
I have a question about something that I heard in the past, and I just wanted to hear your thoughts about it.
Mm-hmm.
So I heard that in the Asian community and stuff, that they're more likely to get loans from the family rather than a bank, and then they pay the family back without interest. I don't know if that's true, or I don't know. That's just something I've heard, and I just wanted to hear your thoughts about that, or
Well, that's true in a lot of poor countries, and largely that's a function of the fact that they don't have formal financial systems, right? So if you can't go to the bank, in many countries, the only option you have is to borrow money from friends or relatives. So, yeah, I mean, I think that is quite common, right? And without getting too much into the weeds, that tends to be a slightly more prevalent in Muslim countries because of prohibitions on finance that exist in the Quran. So interestingly, once again, I don't want to get too much off on a tangent, but there is this kind of stereotype about how Jewish people are involved in finance, but there is a slight historical cause of this stereotype, in that traditionally Muslims are not allowed to lend money to other Muslims at interest. And so if a Muslim needed a loan, where would they have to go to? They'd have to go to a non-Muslim, which in many countries meant you had to go to somebody who's Jewish. And so, this is an example of how a religious belief could influence economic outcomes, right? And it certainly has influenced this stereotype about different cultures, right? I don't think the stereotype really holds much water today, but once stereotypes get embedded in the popular conception, right, they're hard to get out. And so, yeah, it is quite possible that religious beliefs could play a role. However, don't take this too far, right? And I think that's maybe the most important point I want to give you is, while culture could play a role, we should not overstate the role that culture plays. Think about China. China has gone from one of the richest areas in the world in the year 1000 to one of the poorest areas of the world to then one of the richest areas of the world, right? It's gone from rich to poor to richer. And in that whole time, what happened to their culture? They've got the same culture, right? It's not culture that's made them rich or poor. The fact is, many cultures are compatible with growth. We see many different cultures and many different countries growing nowadays. And so we should not fall into this trap of thinking about culture as being the main thing that determines how rich a country is. Can it play a role? Yes, certain cultural beliefs could play a role, but we don't want to give it too much importance here. In fact, and one of the reasons I'm emphasizing this is that I think many people have essentially used culture as a proxy for discrimination or for stereotyping or biasing against some countries, right? So for instance, saying, well, Africa is a disaster because look at their culture, right? That kind of attitude is just as simply stereotyping and racial discrimination that's kind of packaged in this nicer word of culture as opposed to outright racism, right? And so, we want to be, as economists, we want to be careful, very careful, not to say that culture plays too big of a role. It could play a role, but I think there's some other things that play a much, much bigger role. Okay, we should take a little bit of break here. So let's take a 5-minute break and we'll meet back at 10:15. Just a couple last things I want to say to finish up chapter 9, and then we'll move on to inequality, okay? All right, so talk to you in 5 minutes. Back from break here, very close to finishing up chapter 9 here. Let's just finish up chapter 9 with a couple of other brief discussions. One is about this whole idea of growth miracles and growth disasters. What is it that causes a growth miracle? In other words, a country that can move from being poor to rich in a short period of time. And what could cause a growth disaster? Meaning a country that was rich and then goes to being poor. To understand a growth disaster, I'm sorry, let's start with a growth miracle. Understanding growth miracles really means understanding that they take place in 3 steps. The first one is a change in institutions. Something happens that fundamentally changes the institutions in a country. and makes them more productive. What then happens? The country will grow fast. Why? Because of diminishing marginal returns. As we've talked about on Monday, what's true? Poor countries have more of an ability to grow fast than richer ones do. So when you have a poor country, and then there's a change in the institutions, that country has a lot of built up potential to grow very fast. And then you have compounding in the rule of 70. If you can maintain that growth rate for a period of time, you will catch up because of compounding. So growth miracles are not that miraculous, to be honest with you. They're not that miraculous. They're pretty easily understood. There's a dramatic change in institutions that then lead to diminishing marginal returns and fast growth. You have huge increases in physical capital and human capital and technology. And because of compounding, you're able to get richer over time. So there's lots of examples of this that we could talk about. Let's talk about, just to pick one, South Korea. How has South Korea gotten to be one of the world's rich countries? And they are today one of the world's rich countries. Well, it's a pretty straightforward process. They were one of the poorest countries in the world. Right? The Civil War in South Korea in the actually it was more in the 50s. Late 50s. Right? A brutal war in South Korea between more pro-markets and then communists. Right? Then at the end of the Civil War, Korea got split into two countries. North Korea, which is what we could call a command economy, meaning it's essentially all decisions are controlled by a small number of people at their command. South Korea reorganized under a market economy. That was the dramatic change in institutions. For South Korea, it was for the better. For North Korea, it was for the worse. South Korea became a growth miracle. North Korea became a growth disaster. And what South Korea has done over time is they've moved up that technology ladder, right? When I was a kid, it's interesting to think how this has changed. But when I was a kid and you went to like the store to get cheap toys, where were those cheap toys made? South Korea, right? Because South Korea was one of the poorest countries in the world. It was a source of cheap labor. Now, when we think about what gets made in South Korea, what do we think about? Cell phones and movies, right? Much, much higher level technology goods, right? And so South Korea has made the transition from a rich country to a poor country, right? It's taken a long time. And as Zach says, the Korean shows on Netflix are amazing, right? And that is true, right? I just saw the other night the movie Minari, which was a South Korean movie that was up for Best Picture. It's a really great movie, right? I mean, they're making great movies. They're making a lot of interesting things in South Korea. I mean, who cannot love Korean pop? I'm getting no reaction from anybody. Nobody threw up. Yeah, that's the unfortunate thing about development in Korea is that they've developed Korean pop music. But outside of that, Korean Korean economic development has been a good thing. And I don't know if you've seen these pictures. Let me pull this up here. Pictures of North Korea versus South Korea at night. Have you guys, any of you seen these? It's kind of interesting. Let me pull it up really quick. If you haven't seen this, yeah, it's interesting. So you can see here the difference between North Korea, South Korea, and up here to the north is China. And you can see at night, North Korea is almost completely black, right? Because of the low level of electricity production. South Korea is completely lit up. China is pretty well lit up, right? Almost completely black, right? And I mean, that's just just one indication of the dramatic differences in income between the two regions. And so we can go on and on across countries, and you can tell similar stories, whether it's Argentina, who in 1880 was one of the richer countries in the world, but since then has basically been a political disaster. Tell the same story about Nigeria, where after their independence from colonization, they basically kind of devolved into their own form of colonization, in which it was, dictators, their homegrown dictators that took over, as opposed to the foreign dictators who took over, right? And so we can do this country by country by country to talk about these things. So anyway, that's our discussion about economic growth, right? And so, as I said, there's so much more that we could say about this. This to me always feels like a topic that is rushed, that we, only really have a time to spend a day and a half about it. But take some more econ classes, right? And we'll talk more about this. But one of the things I like about this discussion, and hopefully it will maybe kind of broaden your thinking about economics, is that when you start to think about economic growth, you really do have to move away from economics, right? That yes, economics can tell us a lot about economic growth, but we also have to understand politics. We have to understand history. We have to understand culture, right? We have to understand a little bit of science, right? Understanding a question like this really does require a liberal arts perspective, right? Because you can't understand institutions without also understanding history and politics, right? And so when it gets down to talking about, for instance, the class I take to China, we'll spend a lot of time talking about Chinese institutions. But to really understand Chinese institutions, you have to understand Chinese society, Chinese history, Chinese culture, Chinese politics, and Chinese economics, right? You got to understand all of that to really kind of understand what's going on in a country like China or any country in the world. And so I think that's always been one of the reasons why these kind of topics have always attracted me to economics, right? Is that, while I love economics, I really love to see the way that economics kind of reaches out beyond just supply and demand, right? And helps us think about the world more broadly. Which I guess is a nice transition to the next topic that I want to talk about in this class. This topic is about economic inequality. And so this is a topic that's not really in your book, but I feel like it's really important to talk about. So just to kind of give you a little bit of background into my thinking about economic inequality. Inequality is not something that, up to 5 or 6 years ago that I really had a particular interest in or really any particular knowledge about it. It's not like this was an area of research for me, either in graduate school or in my early days of publishing. But just as I kind of, interested in politics, interested in what's happening in the economy, and began to read some of the fantastic research that economists are doing about the causes of inequality and the consequences of inequality, I really got interested in this, and I've kind of myself moved to thinking about economic inequality as one of the most important issues today in macroeconomics. And so that kind of got me interested enough to think, well, maybe I need to write a book about this, kind of putting together some of the thinking about economics in a rational, logical way. And so a couple of years ago, I wrote a book about inequality. But I've also felt very strongly that this is something that we should talk about in a intro to the macro class, right? Even though this is not really something that's in your textbook, I think it's a really important topic for us to talk about. If for no other reasons, then we need to understand economic inequality to be reasonable citizens of the world we live in, right? Because unless we understand the kind of inequality that's going on out there, it's hard to understand a lot of social issues that's going on in this country, whether it's our attitudes towards immigration, education, the social welfare, all right, on and on and on, right? So what I want to do here a little bit this morning and a little bit this afternoon, and obviously this discussion is going to be abbreviated too, but talk about economic inequality, right? Talk about economic inequality. And I basically want to talk about first some of the facts about inequality, and then talk about, well, why is this happening? Okay. So what I'd like to do this morning is talk about these 6 big facts, and these are from the reading that I gave you. Talk about that this morning, and then this afternoon, spend a little bit more time talking about, well, why is inequality going up in the US? But first, let's establish that inequality is going up in the US, because it is. Okay, the Gini coefficient in the US and other countries has been rising since the 1980s, but in the US, significantly. What's the Gini coefficient? Listen, understanding the Gini coefficient in detail really takes us beyond the scope of this class. But really, the Gini coefficient is one statistic that measures inequality. And it's a statistic that varies between 0 and 1. Gini coefficient of 0 would mean that there was perfect equality in the country, meaning everybody had equal amounts. And a Gini coefficient of 1 would mean one person owned everything. So a Gini coefficient is essentially one statistic that tries to capture how unequal income is. And it varies between 0 and 1. How you calculate a Gini coefficient, we're not going to talk about that because it really takes us beyond the scope of this class. But if you look at what's happened, dang it. I'm sorry, hold on. Let me pull up my notes. Something went on here. So if you look at the Gini coefficient in the US, what have we seen? That this Gini coefficient has risen significantly in the US since the 1980s, up to early 1900 standards. So measured by the Gini coefficient alone, inequality has gone up in the US. Now, a Gini coefficient is one way. The nice thing about the Gini coefficient is it's one statistic. The bad thing is, obviously, one statistic is not going to be able to tell you everything you need to know about inequality. So another way that economists often try to measure inequality is by looking at what we call income shares, meaning the top 10%. Sorry, something weird is going on with my iPad today. Damn it. Okay. So the second fact is that if you look at the top 10%, the top 1%, the top 0.1%, the top 0.01%, their income shares are growing very fast. And in fact, what's happening is that they're getting most of the new income. Most income that is being generated, new income, is going to the top 10%. Of the top 10%, who's doing the best? The top 1%. Of the top 1%, who's doing the best? The top 0.1%. Of the top 0.1%, who's doing the best? The top 0.01%, right? As you get richer, you are doing better in this economy. So much so that look at this graph here. This is looking at the income shares of the top 1% versus the bottom 50%. Today, the top 1% are earning more than 20% of all income. So if the US income, total income is $100, the top 1% are getting 20 of those dollars. What about the bottom 50%? They're getting only 12%. So the bottom half is getting about $12 of the $100, and the top 1% is getting $20 of that $100, right? And if we looked at the top 0.1%, who is that? The top 0.1%, just to give you some idea of who we're talking about here, the top 1% is basically people who are making more than $180,000 a year, right? That's who this top 1% is. The top 0.1% is people making more than $500,000 a year. The top 0.01% is people making about $1.3 million a year, right? As you go up and up, they're doing better and better, right? So in other words, of this top 1%, most of that is going to the top 0.1%. Those families that are making more than, what did I say, $500,000 a year, right? So income inequality is getting worse and worse. And you can see here how this doesn't look like a very sustainable situation, right? When half the population is earning much less than the top 1% of the population. Okay, these first two facts are talking only about income, meaning how much you earn per year. But what happens if you look at wealth? Global wealth is even more unequal. If you just look at the 20 richest Americans, the 20 richest Americans have a wealth that is greater than the poorest half of Americans. In 2017 in the US, there are about 2,000 billionaires, which is kind of a crazy large number. Oh, and I'm sorry, that's not in the US. That's across the globe. Of these 2,043 billionaires, anybody have a guess how many are women? $227 are women. 2/3 of these women inherited their wealth. How many are Black? Ten. How many are Black women? 3. One of them is Oprah. I don't know who the other 2 are, but the fact that that if we thought long enough, we could probably figure out who it is. It goes to tell you how rare this is, right? So when you think about income inequality and how unequal it is, I mean, when we begin to think about wealth, we see even more inequality. So if you look at global average wealth, meaning you just take global wealth and divide it by the population, there should be, on average, about $56,000 of wealth per person across this globe. But then, if instead of measuring an average, we looked at the median, meaning we ranked the poorest people to the wealthiest people, and we picked the person in the middle, what's their wealth? Only about $3,500. You all know enough statistics to know that when you have that big a difference between average and median, you have a very skewed distribution. Okay, that is an extremely skewed distribution, right? Now, a lot of people, I mean, as we're going to talk about, there's many reasons to be worried about this kind of inequality. But one of the reasons why we worry about this kind of inequality is that we look in most democracies, growing inequality is actually shrinking the number of people who are in the middle class. In other words, we're having an increase in the number of rich people, which is great, but what that means is that there's less left over for everybody else, so we're getting more poverty, and we're getting fewer people in the middle class. So here's looking at the percentage of the population in the middle class in rich democracies. And notice here that the percent of the population in the middle class is shrinking in all of these democracies. But in the US, it's shrinking particularly, right? So if we went back In 1980, we saw that about 35% of the population was in the middle class. Today, it's about 28% of the population, right? Why is the middle class so important? Well, there's a lot of reasons, but for those of you who've taken some political philosophy, you know that one thing that political philosophers tend to agree upon is democracies work well when there's a large middle class, right? In other words, when there's a lot of people in the middle, that's when democracies tend to function well. What happens if you don't have a middle class and you have a lot of rich and a lot of poor people? What you're going to get is you're going to get a lot of tension. And that's going to create a less well-functioning democracy, right? Of course, in 3 sentences, I'm summarizing thousands of years of political theory, right? But, the discussion's deeper than that. But I mean, I think that is a general conclusion, is that democracies are likely to work best when you have a strong, well-functioning middle class. And that's increasingly, the US is becoming less and less a middle-class country, where we have rich people and then we have, quite a bit of poor people. And despite the growth in our economy, what have we seen here is that child poverty, and total poverty just basically remains flat, right? Despite these increases in wealth we've had overall, we have persistently high poverty, particularly relative to other rich countries like in Europe or in Japan. So that is all the bad news, okay? And that's a fair amount of bad news. I do, though, want to talk about a couple of good things that's happening in inequality. The first 4 facts that I've talked about have to do with inequality within the US, okay? Mainly do with inequality within the US, which is getting worse no matter how you measure it. But what happens if we look at inequality across the globe? There we do see some improvement. If instead of thinking about things in terms of a country, we think about the globe, one of the things we see is that the global middle class is gaining ground.
We can't see your screen.
Sorry, I forgot to switch. Right, so the global middle class here is gaining ground. If we look back in 1981, 42% of the world's population was living in poverty. Today, that number has fallen to 9%. That is a remarkable fall in global poverty. So if we look across the globe, we're doing much better. If I could summarize exactly why this has happened, primarily it's happened for a fairly obvious reason. China and India. Growth in China and India have pulled millions of people out of poverty. So China today, 350 million less people live in poverty than they did in 1975. That's a population greater than the United States. So that huge, just China and India alone are responsible for most of this increase above poverty. And so what does this mean? It means the global middle class is actually doing pretty well. They're doing better. To put this another way, if you don't know where you're going to be born, there's probably no better time to be born than right now. Does that make any sense? Or to say it this way, if you're going to be the median person in the world, this is probably the best time to ever be born, because you will live at a higher standard of living than you ever have in the past for that median person, for the average person. One way to kind of capture this, though, or I guess another way to kind of think about this is, while it's been good for the global middle class, that doesn't mean that the last few years have been great for everybody. Okay? So this is looking at total income growth across the globe. And this is looking between 1980 and 2016. And so what have we seen? What about the people who are living at the lowest levels of income? They've actually seen pretty high growth rates. Who else has seen really high growth rates? The global rich. But who has not seen so much growth? This kind of upper middle class. But who is in the upper middle class? Well, middle class Americans are in the upper middle class for the globe, right? And so you can kind of think about this as, yeah, the global poor have done well, the global rich have done well, but who hasn't done so great is the rich middle class. The rich middle class has gotten squeezed. So this graph is often called the elephant curve. And I guess it's called the elephant curve because it's supposed to look like an elephant. I don't really quite see that. But you know, you have up here the trunk is doing good, and I don't know, the back or the butt is doing good. But yeah, it's these people in the middle, particularly in the upper middle class, that are not doing so well. Here's another way of seeing this. Hold on, I don't know if we can, hopefully you can see this. So this is looking at the global income distribution, how income was distributed in the year 1800 and 1975 and 2015. So look at 1800, right? The vast majority of the world's population is living below the poverty line of about $2 a day, right? So the vast majority of the people are living, and it's way skewed over here to the left, meaning at very low levels of income. Where were we in 1975? In 1975, we had basically moved to two different worlds, right? A rich world and a poor world. Rich world is this hump over here in the right, where people are living at fairly comfortable levels of income, but then you still had this huge number of people that were living below the poverty line. Where are we today in 2015? A lot better, right? Look how most of the world now is above that poverty line, okay? That has been great. In fact, maybe this is the most important fact of the last 50 years. Certainly, I would argue this is the most important economic fact of your lifetime, is how many people now are living above the global poverty line, right? It's an amazing achievement. It's one of the most important increases in welfare from a global perspective. But as we've talked about in the US, maybe it's not that exciting because what do people in the middle class in the US see? They see low income growth. And who do they see doing better? The people below them and the people above them. And they feel like they're being squeezed, right? The global poor are getting better. The global rich are getting better, but it's this middle income, right? Or the US middle income and upper middle income that seem to be getting squeezed.
Why is that? Why?
Well, we're
Is
going to
that-
have, we're going to talk a little bit about that this afternoon, Zach. So I'm going to put you off for a few minutes, okay? However, all of this said, it is still a fact.
Need to switch back to the notes.
Thank you. It is still a fact when we think about global inequality, it is still a fact that where you live, not who you are, is the biggest story in global inequality. In other words, that's citizenship premium. Place matters. Why does place matter so much? Well, just think about what we talked about in chapter 9. Fundamentally, what determines whether you're going to be rich in a rich country or poor in a poor country? What is it? Well, you have to have high productivity, meaning you have to have high physical capital, human capital, technology. But what ultimately determines those things?
Trade?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you, Zach.
Is it trade?
Trade as part of the bigger idea of guys are making me worried. What do we spend the first hour of class talking about? Right? In a word, what's the key determinant of how much physical capital, human capital, and technology you have?
Productivity.
Well, productivity is determined by how much physical capital, human capital, and technology you have. But what determines your incentives to invest in human capital, physical capital, and technology?
Institutions.
Institutions, right? And institutions are associated with place because they're formed by the society you live in the government that you live under. Institutions are fundamentally associated with place. And that's why location matters so much when it comes to global inequality. Why is it that a person from the Congo gets on a plane and they land in the United States, and the second they land in the United States, their income goes up by a factor of 90? Have they changed on the flight over? No, they haven't changed. What's changed? The institutions and the incentives that they live under, right? Now they are surrounded by much better incentives to make rather than take. And importantly, they're surrounded by more smart people. They have more physical capital. They have more human capital to use. So this is fundamentally why we have a citizenship premium, right? Is because institutions matter. Where you are determines the institutions you live under. This is true across countries, but believe it or not, it's even true within countries, all right? It's even true within countries. Okay, let me show you a picture that will kind of blow your mind. So this is a picture of income in the United States. And in this picture, the blue area is half of US GDP and the orange area is half of GDP. Okay, so the orange and the blue are the same share of GDP. Look at this picture. Blue is half of GDP, orange is half of GDP. Two Americas, right? There are two Americas. What is this picture showing us? Urban areas are much richer than rural areas in the United States. Why? Well, part of this is institutions. Part of this is in urban areas, you have much more access to physical capital, human capital, and technology. Why? Because you are around smarter, more educated people. We know that this is a problem in Iowa, right? What's happened to a lot of small Iowa communities? What do people your age do? They go to college and then they go to a city, right? Why? Because you are more likely to be productive around other educated people. But the consequence of this is that it has hollowed out a lot of America, right? Where the best and the brightest have essentially migrated, right? Internally migrated. They've migrated from rural areas to urban areas. And they've migrated from the interior to the coasts. And so as Logan says, this looks like the election results. Exactly. Exactly, right? Because as we're going to talk a little bit this afternoon, there's no better prediction of how you vote than what your education level is, right? And so, in fact, as we'll talk about this afternoon, pretty much education is determining everything in our society nowadays. It's determining how long you live, what your health is, how you vote, where you live, right? It's all closely tied to education. And so, yeah, this is what we're seeing. It even goes into what we call, and we'll talk a little bit more about this afternoon, intergenerational mobility. Intergenerational mobility, that is a big word. But what it really means is how closely related a child's income is to their parents' income. What's the correlation between a child's income and a parent's income? The more that there's a correlation between the two, that means that there's less mobility, right? So in other words, if a kid's income is very well predicted by a parent's income, that's very little mobility. What do we see in the US in general? The US has very low income mobility, despite this fact that we tend to believe that we're like one of these countries where like the poor rise up. That's not the case. Relative to other countries, we actually have less intergenerational income mobility than other countries. But one of the interesting things, and this is what you see in this picture, is that it varies greatly between where you live in the United States. So the lighter areas here have more mobility, and the red areas have less mobility. So the good news here, look at Iowa. Iowa actually, of the 50 states, is the state that has the highest level of income mobility. And I've never actually seen a research paper looking at why that is. I suspect it's also related to the fact that Iowa has some of the highest rates of migration. And so in other words, kids leaving and moving to more urban areas and greatly increasing their income. But look at what's happened, for instance, in the US South, where there's very little intergenerational mobility. Across the United States, the correlation between a kid's income and their parents' income is about the correlation between a kid's height and their parents' height. Right? To put that in some perspective, that's how little mobility there is. Right? Is just as a parent's height largely predicts how large a kid's height is, a parent's income largely predicts how the income of their kids. And so even setting aside the income and wealth inequality, this is worrisome. We might be willing to accept inequality if we knew that it was a case that some poor people who have skills are becoming rich. And likewise, if we knew some rich people were becoming poor. The fact of the matter is, you're pretty much born into your income bracket, right? Both by being born in the US, but also as to whether your parents are rich or not. That cannot be an equitable system, right? It just simply can't be an equitable system. Right? And so this is where we're going to pick up this afternoon. I want to talk at least briefly about some of the reasons why income inequality has been going up. What are some of the driving factors of this? And once again, we're going to have to, by necessity, be pretty brief. But I want to talk about some of the factors that are driving this. As we're going to see, some of these factors are very difficult to think about how you would deal with them, right? For instance, one of the factors we're going to talk about is who you guys date and marry, because your choices about who you marry are playing a big role in income inequality in the U.S. So we'll talk about that this afternoon, and then I'm going to save a little bit of time at the end of class to go over our exam today, okay? So we're going to end morning class now. In a few minutes, I'll send you your exam on email, okay? So you can, one of the things I'd ask you to do, just spend a couple of minutes over a break taking a look at your exam, and so that you have some idea about what questions you want to ask, but then I'll go over the exam in some detail this afternoon, okay? All right, have a good lunch, and we'll see you back here at 12:30.
Is there any end of chapter 9 questions that you would gonna recommend, like you've been doing in the?
You know what? I didn't think about that, Gabe. I'll look over break and I'll give you some this afternoon, okay?